Civil Rights Act of 1964. Of course, before the Civil Rights Movement, racism and discrimination was at its highest. Following the Civil War, the legislature passed a trio of acts that abolished slavery, granted citizenship to former slaves, and gave all men the right to vote. Even with this advancement for African Americans, the Southern states secretly kept them limited with literacy tests, poll taxes, and other barriers that didn't allow them to excel. Decades later, the legislature still did not pass civil rights acts even with all the evident racism going around the United States. Then, during the 1960s, President Kennedy imposed the idea of the Civil Rights Act. However, the legislature still did not permit it. Once Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson took control and made a push for its passing. The Civil Rights Act officially passed in 1964. Under this act, all segregation based on race, religion, or origin was prohibited in public spaces. It helped push for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, as well as the Fair Housing Act. It did help push for more equality in America, however, it took forever for full desegregation to start. The act has had positive impacts on America's society today as we are integrated. The minorities of the United States have made strides in the corporate world, entertainment world, and any other field of occupation that we have. Although the Civil Rights Act did allow for a more integrated society, there are still major race issues between African Americans and Caucasians today. The solution or solutions are still a mystery, but it takes more than just an act or a law to fix an issue so complex.
According to August Nims, who works in the Department of Political Science and African American Studies at the University of Minnesota, says the Civil Rights Act was passed first and people were disappointed with the results because African Americans could vote, but the literary tests in the southern states were too hard for people to pass in order to vote. They fought for this right, and after a year, the Voting Rights Act was passed. They fought through Bloody Sunday and the Selma to Montgomery March, and they fought in Birmingham to get their rights. There were even riots after the Voting Rights Act was passed, and people were still fighting for equality. The long, hot summers were just starting, and they ended in 1968 after Martin Luther King's assassination. There was progress made with the voting rights, but because of disenfranchisement laws, it is now harder for minorities to vote.
Brown v. Board of Education 1. On May 14, 1954, Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren ruled unanimously that state-sanctioned segregation of public schools were unconstitutional and went against the 14th Amendment, which grants all citizens life, liberty, or property. This court ruling overturned the separate but equal decision of the Plessy v. Ferguson case 60 years earlier. Even with the decision, states still refused to desegregate public schools and eradicate their sanctions. Brown v. Board of Education 2. On May 31, 1955, Chief Justice Warren reiterated the court's unanimous decision and enforced the rule to the states to begin desegregating public schools with all deliberate speed. According to the 2016 article by Corrida Brown, a sociologist at Brown University, desegregation of schools allowed for a more harmonious society. But with this, it also creates underlying issues. Despite two unanimous rulings in court, desegregation of schools caused a quote, cultural trauma. Brown. In response to integration in schools, segregationist whites became disgruntled and outraged, as in the case of the Little Rock Nine. In September 4, 1957, 9 African American students were enrolled in a formerly all-white school, Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas. As a retaliation against federal ruling, Governor Orville Faubus called in the state's National Guard to block the students' entry into the schools. Later that month, President Dwight Eisenhower sent in federal troops to escort the students into the school and to protect them from the angry mob outside. In the 1957 picture by Burt Glenn, a national photographer for Magnum Photos, the image clearly shows the soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division escorting the students into the school building, with the angry mob outside. In September 25, 1957, 14 days after the official start of the school, the students of the Little Rock Nine finally began their first full day of school. The ruling of the Brown v. Board of Education case made an impact on society now. Today, many schools have a strong policy against discrimination and prejudice to students, and integration remains prevalent today. All schools are required to admit students and consider every student equally.
Before affirmative action was passed as law in 1961, African Americans were denied representation in the workplace as well as other areas due to their race. Civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X worked to solve this problem by canceling out the racial quotas. In this photograph by Stan Wayman, featured in a Time article, Martin Luther King Jr. meets with Lyndon B. Johnson in order to discuss allowing African Americans to be represented in all areas, like the workplace, without being discriminated against because of their race. This shows the attempts African Americans had to make in order to pass the legislation to have equal opportunities. According to Britta Waldschmidt Nelson, professor of transatlantic history and culture at the University of Augsburg, this was to aim at helping traditionally underrepresented groups in order to add to overall social justice and equality, including for women, veterans, and people with disabilities. In Nelson's novel, chronicling the lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., she describes the various legislations passed in the civil rights era, such as affirmative action. The passing of this legislation has allowed African Americans to study at elite universities and also have more advantages when starting in the workplace than ever before. In 1960, 55% of all African Americans lived under the poverty line, which went down to a third in the 1990s and less than a quarter at 24% today. As a result of affirmative action, there have been many more openings in the business world for African Americans. Now, a generation later, there is an increase in white hostility toward affirmative action. In the opposers' views, the past years of affirmative action have been enough to compensate, and now affirmative action is creating unfair advantages to minorities and taking from whites. In this photograph, titled An Argument Against Affirmative Action, Caucasian students are seen protesting against affirmative action with signs calling for it to be abolished. This is in relation to the Supreme Court case Regents of the University of California versus Back, in which Alan Back was denied access to UC due to the college's involvement in affirmative action. This photograph shows just how much of a conflict remains today due to the legislation passed. Therefore, this 1961 passing of affirmative action as a law prohibiting this discrimination has still maintained controversy among people today, who claim affirmative action is a preference program that only establishes racial differences. This information illustrates perfectly how the passing of the civil rights legislations have had great positive effects, but also cause issues in society today, remaining controversial a generation later.
Can you give me your name, age, grade, and extracurriculars?
My name is Tyler Treview. I'm 18. I'm a freshman at the University of Kentucky. I'm a freshman representative for the Black Student Union, and I am on the Planned Parenthood Teen Council.
What is your name, occupation, and duration of occupation?
I'm Melanie Gowen. I teach history here at UK and have done so since the late 90s.
How have some of these laws or acts made an impact on society today, negative or positive?
I think that I don't think that the acts that were passed were negative, but it didn't really change anything now because people still aren't able to vote because of the disenfranchisement laws that were put into place after the election of President Barack Obama, because they wanted an angry white man in office again. And with affirmative action, there's still discrimination in the workplace where, like, African Americans can't wear their hair in dreadlocks or weave, which is a part of our culture. And some people are discriminated against based off their sexual orientation.
You know, I mean, there's always the point of view that laws can change policies, they can change behavior to a certain degree. But it doesn't necessarily change people's hearts or their attitudes. And I often talk about in classes how sports help to move people, start to shift their racial views in the late 60s, early 1970s. Black athletes like Muhammad Ali, I was talking about him the other day, really important in challenging America's racial views. You know, I mean, I think we're living in a time period, had we talked about this 5-10 years ago, I often heard from students that we were living in a post-racial society, that America had problems with class differences and divisions, but race was an issue that had sort of faded to the background, that we didn't have those problems. You know, it's not like the 1960s where this was an issue. America had kind of tamed its racial divides, and we're not saying that anymore. I'm not hearing that from students here in 2017, and events of recent years have really dredged that up. I mean, America has not come to terms with its racial past very clearly. And in looking at this, I mean, this is recent history. When we talk about the 1960s, even how recent these events are, and the massive resistance you see throughout the Deep South. We're living in a society where that is our inheritance, and those are the views that even living in 2017 continue to be woven in the DNA of our country. And so, yeah, we have the Civil Rights Act, and we can say, oh well, goodness gracious, thank goodness we don't look in the newspaper anymore and see that they're looking for a colored worker, particularly for a job, maybe in domestic service, and the kind of employment opportunities that were available based on one's race in the 1960s. Thank goodness we've moved beyond that. Things are so much different today, but I wonder if that's really the case when you look at the events of the last few years, if we have put that to rest.
As a history teacher, what do you teach your students about the civil rights movement and how we have changed as a people due to these acts or laws?
One thing I stress about the civil rights movement is that it is a long movement, and historians now have really taken that term, the long civil rights movement, and that frames the way we think about it, rather than seeing it as something that emerges in the 1950s. Oh, we got Brown decision, suddenly everyone's interested in race relations, and then Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat, and suddenly we've got the civil rights movement. We kind of struggle over it for a decade or so, and then America sees the light, and we decide everyone should be equal. That's kind of the impression I think a lot of Americans have of the civil rights movement, and I try and disrupt that, both in showing that this is not something that happens over the course of 10, 15, 20 years. From the moment the Civil War ends and Reconstruction begins, that's when the civil rights movement is beginning. And that is a continual, although it's simmering underneath the surface at certain points in time. But this is a long fight that's going on.
Do you think that there are some governmental changes that need to be done to aid in our current racial issues?
Governmental issues, are you talking here laws? What are
laws, or who we have in office, who's on the Congress and stuff like that, who we have in the houses?
Honestly, I think until here in the United States we apologize for slavery, I don't think we're going to see any fixes to the racial divide. I think this is going to be a continuing issue, and sometimes we kind of tamp it down. It flares up in particular moments in time, which we're in a moment like that again. But I think this is going to continue to drag at our heels until, as a nation, we say slavery was wrong. White Americans have largely benefited from slavery in some really important ways, in wealth building and the inheritance, even education, the head start that we got because of slavery. Slavery is our story, and we recognize it as evil. Until we're ready to say that, I don't know if laws or policies are really going to be the change we need.